Hello, in this video, we are going to be covering the concept of the cell cycle. And in the cell cycle, the cell is going to prepare itself to divide, and then it will divide so that we get two daughter cells. So essentially, one cell is going to become two cells. So in the cell cycle, the cell is going to be growing and preparing itself, and then it's going to essentially divide in half. And so the first part of the cell cycle is called interphase, and it is all of this here in this circle. So the majority of the cell cycle is interphase, where the cell is growing and preparing. Now, in interphase, there are subcategories or subsections. And so the first part of interphase is called G1, and that is just regular cell growth. The cell is growing, gaining nutrients, getting bigger, and kind of just getting ready to divide. And then we go into S phase. In S phase, the DNA is replicated, or also known as DNA synthesis. So the S for synthesis. And the reason why we go through this process is because, again, the cell is going to divide into two cells, and you need to have the same copy of DNA for both cells. Because if you didn't replicate your DNA, you'd basically only have half of the DNA in one cell and half of the DNA in the other. But we want to, obviously, both cells need to have the same DNA, so we have to replicate the DNA. So you have two copies of DNA at the end of S phase. And then we go into G2. G2 is just more cell growth. The cell is preparing itself until it gets into the mitotic phase. So in the mitotic phase, the cell is actually actively dividing in half. And there's really two main parts. There's mitosis, where the cell is trying to organize its DNA and make sure that its DNA is separated into two parts equally. And then there's cytokinesis, where the rest of the cell divides. So all of the other organelles, the cytoplasm, and then finally the cell membrane just splits in half. And so then we end up with two daughter cells at the end of the cell cycle. And then this just keeps going over and over again. Now, the cell cycle is really important for the cell, and so there's a lot of regulation in the cell cycle. And what I mean by that is that the cell has these checkpoints to prevent itself from continuing until it's actually ready. And so there's the first checkpoint, which is towards the end of G1. And in this checkpoint, the cell is asking itself, am I large enough? So, am I healthy enough to basically continue? And it also checks if its DNA is damaged. If the DNA is damaged, or if the cell is not big enough or healthy enough, then it will not continue through the cell cycle. And this is a really important checkpoint because after this, the cell will go into S phase and it's going to replicate its DNA. And so that's a huge commitment. You're, using a lot of energy to replicate your DNA, and you basically can't go back after that. And so this is kind of the main checkpoint to make sure, am I really ready to go through this process? And then we go into G2, and towards the end of G2, there is another checkpoint. Kind of the same thing. The cell is making sure it's big enough, has enough nutrients, etc. Because right after G2 is going to be mitosis, and there's a lot going on in mitosis. And one of the main things that happens in G2 is it double checks that the DNA has been, correctly replicated. So we have two copies of the DNA, and everything it looks good. And then there is a checkpoint in actual mitosis. We call it the M checkpoint. And, I'll talk about this in a different video, but essentially in the M checkpoint, we are making sure that the chromosomes are attached to the spindle fibers. That will make a lot more sense in my mitosis video, but just know that there's another checkpoint in mitosis itself. And regulation of the cell cycle is extremely important because regular cell division is something that happens in the human body. But increased cell division is going to be an issue because if for whatever reason one of these checkpoints is not working properly, your cells are going to be dividing out of control, and that can lead to a tumor. Or in another situation, if we have decreased apoptosis, by the way, is when a cell goes through suicide, when it realizes, hey, there's something really wrong with me. I'm just going to go away now. And so cells can go through apoptosis when they know that there's something wrong. But if a cell is incapable of figuring out that something's wrong with it, then it's going to continue to divide and again form a tumor. And so continuing on with this concept of, the cell cycle being really important in terms of cancer, there is this protein called P53. P53 is found in all cells, and what it does is it detects if there is any kind of DNA damage or any kind of abnormalities, and it essentially stops the cell from going through the cell cycle if something is wrong. And again, in a normal, cell, you're going to have P53, which will stop the cell cycle when there is DNA damage, etc. And then it will also trigger things like DNA repair, etc. Or if the cell is really damaged, it will just go through apoptosis. Now, there are situations where the P53 protein / gene is mutated, and if it is mutated, then what ends up happening is even if the cell is damaged, it will continue to go through the cell cycle, and again, we can form a tumor because now your cells are growing out of control, and this is how cancers form. And again, this is just one of many situations where cancer can form, but P53 is one of the most well-studied proteins that is linked to cancer. So that's all I have for this video. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.